Welcome to week 13, where we will be discussing the political parties in a little more depth. Although we have touched on them and their role in each of our institutions, we will be dealing with them straight on this week. So first I want to talk about a couple of theories of party behavior, including this idea of historical party alignments and also these two main party paradigms that may help us to better understand where our party system fits in the larger scheme of things. The first thing we have to do is talk about realignment theory. Realignment theory is a political science theory that deals with the parties in the United States and how they seem to have a pattern. So if you look at the illustration at the bottom, what happens is that there is a long, stable party alignment. If you're looking at this as a timeline, that time should stretch out larger than the rest. Each era has this stable party alignment, and then there are factions within the dominant party, which can be a feud or a third-party challenge or a splinter party. And the status quo is eventually changed drastically by a critical election wherein the power shifts. And so, kind of like a pendulum swing, and it seems to happen all at once. So stable party alignments are times when the majority party wins most of the offices, and usually the presidency, and the minority party has far less influence. Factions within the majority party usually happen as a result of groups entering the electorate or influential groups leaving the electorate, so that there's a composition change in the entire electorate that triggers this. And we study these not to memorize every detail. If you have taken 120 with me, you'll know that we go through the eras in particular, and that's to help understand this theory a little bit better. But the key priority here isn't to understand each era, although they're listed below, and there are some questions as to whether there was a sixth era and maybe a seventh era. But to understand that there are shifts that bring us to today, that realignment theory can help explain, at least to some degree, why the Democrats are not the same as the Democratic Republicans of the Jeffersonian era, or the Democrats of the Jacksonian era, or even the Democrats of the New Deal era. So most of us know at this point that the parties have shifted a great deal, and that the names themselves don't represent what the parties' historical track record has been and what their current beliefs are. If you want to know a little bit more about this, I can actually post one of my 120 lectures which talks about these eras in a little more depth. But for now, just understand that they are there. There's also this idea of how parties influence government. So there's two main party paradigms that might help us understand a little bit better how our party system either is similar or different from those in Western Europe. And this is a generalization. This is not to say that every government outside of ours in Western tradition follows these rules, but quite often what I hear students say is, why aren't our parties more like those in the UK or in France or in Germany? Well, there's some structural reasons behind that, but there are also some ideological reasons. So a paradigm is this universally accepted and irreconcilable theory about how the world or a piece of it works. And so in the Western European paradigm, parties act differently. They act in what's, according to political science literature, the party government paradigm. And U.S. parties act rationally, which is an economic term, in a rational, efficient paradigm. And so we can look down at each of these qualifiers and see how they differ. In terms of ideology of party members, parties in the party government paradigm are very cohesive in terms of ideology. But partisans may differ on issues and ideas in the rational, efficient paradigm. In the rational, efficient paradigm, the reason why there is this difference is that parties are a collection of people that have similar but not the same views, and so there's a broad spectrum of acceptable behavior within each party. And so the ideology between parties in a party government paradigm, the second one down, is that they are distinct on issue stances, whereas in the US, there is some issue overlap, and that may change and shift over time, but generally there are things that Republicans and Democrats agree on. Now, there are many things that they don't, and never before in history have we had such difference in our parties as we do currently. But there is still some issue overlap. Voters in the systems choose how to vote differently depending on what system they are in. So in a party government paradigm, you vote for the party label, whereas in a rational, efficient paradigm, you vote for individual candidates. The power of the majority party is much stronger in a party government paradigm, even though in the US the majority party might have a majority in all branches, it still has to answer to some degree to a minority, or at least to minority views. And the roles of the party are different. In the party government paradigm, the parties are the primary means of influencing government, and as a result, they have massive membership and participation. But in the US, the parties are only one way of influencing government. We have interest groups and individual ways of contacting and influencing our members of Congress and elected officials. So that party membership is hard to define. It's not consistent, and it's usually a loyal core with circles of influence moving outward. The major difference between these two party paradigms is one that's actually not listed here. The party government paradigm is more ideological. It's an ideological way of governing where the party is used to effectuate change within the government. So if a party wins a majority, they can wholesale change the government. But in the rational, efficient paradigm, the purpose of parties is not to change the government or to change policy, but it's merely to win elections. And so parties in the history of the United States have not been there for ideological means, but have been there for electoral means. And so the primary goal is to win elections, win seats, win power, not necessarily to shift policy. And so all of these things that we have talked about so far flow through to those two main goals, and you can differentiate the party systems based on this. So often when we hear, well, Europe acts differently about their parties, why don't we act this way? Whether that's third parties, which we'll talk about in a little bit, or the way parties act when they have a majority versus having a minority and what's an opposition party. The reason is those are two different paradigms. And we simply do not have the ideological and legal and structural mechanisms identical to those who subscribe to a different view. So let's talk about what the modern parties in the U.S. do. The first is to look at them in an organizational way. So the parties are organized on a national level as committees. There's a governing body, the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee. These are bodies that shrink during non-election years and grow during election years, but generally have some long-standing cycle-to-cycle staff and cycle-to-cycle officials. There is a chair who is the national leader of the party machine, not necessarily an elected official. In fact, many successful party chairs are not elected officials. They are strategists in many ways. That's the chair's role. The National Convention occurs regularly to nominate candidates and approve the platform, and the platform is the official ideology of the party written down in a long document that says that this is what the party believes in. Now, the difference, again, between our parties and parties in Western Europe and elsewhere is that the national platform is not something everybody has to sign on to. In fact, the presidential candidate may not believe in things that are in the party platform. So the party platform is usually a compromise document rather than something that represents everybody within the party. The state and local organizations usually follow a national framework with various changes for different states, including different caucuses, different interest group representation, and so on. The party leadership works in a variety of ways, and we see this strongly in Congress. The partisan leaders in Congress tend to be party leaders at the national level. This can be both formal and informal, depending on who the person is. And so, formally, there are certain mechanisms that are used, like choosing partisan leaders in each chamber, Speaker of the House, Majority Leader, Minority Leader, etc., reaching out to subpopulations, appointing party committees, including the Steering and Policy Committee, for example, and changes in rules and procedures have to do with party line votes. And then there's informal rules of the party, like assigning partisans to committees and which committees get certain members of Congress. There's also the issue of promoting party unity, and this can be done through social mechanisms, parties, gatherings, networks of spouses, families, etc. Press appearances can be used for publicity for the party, but also there are services done on behalf of partisans for their members, like the scheduling of members' bills based on certain priorities, and so on. Publicity for the party, press appearances, PR strategies, those are all party leadership mechanisms for making sure that the party message is heard. And then there's electoral or campaign assistance for members. So things like fundraising, the use and setup of political action committees, and allowing people to introduce things in advance in a legislative agenda for electoral purposes. So we're going to talk about our reading in a little bit about the American Political Science Association's kind of prescient call in the 1950s about issues with the two-party system. But let's talk about where we are, at least right now. There are some pros to our system. It's predictable and stable. We know how things are going to work, we know the players involved, and we know the timeline for certain decisions. Generally, parties make democracy easier by sorting through the myriad of issues and candidates that would otherwise be present. They are accountable through elections. When a party loses elections, they get the message that something is wrong and need to fix it. And they look for ways to solve issues and to synthesize issues in a way that is more palatable for the general public. And overall, they help narrow the field of candidates so we don't have, large primaries where we have 20 people running for one congressional seat. Now, on the other hand, there are a significant number of cons, which is why people generally do not like political parties in the U.S. That predictability can be too predictable. They can be too beholden to special interests, and these aren't necessarily interests with money, although that happens. The problems that we see with large bureaucracies, red tape, uninhibited growth, slow to move and change, all of those things can happen with the political parties themselves. They are, in fact, bureaucracies. They are focused in the U.S. on winning over policy change, and so winning seats ends up being the goal, and then when it comes time to governing, they lack a cohesive strategy for that. If the parties are strong enough to win, they are often strong enough to game the system, meaning they can find loopholes in existing law and regulations to make it more difficult for others to pose a credible challenge. And then, as we'll talk about with Mayhew, we have the issue with divided government. So why only two major parties? Well, first, there are several explanations that are sometimes given. Some of them have been tested, and it's hard to test for others. So we'll go along and talk about that as we go through. First, there is a dualist idea that there's a natural dualism in democratic institutions. You're either voting for someone or against someone, and so therefore it makes sense that there are only two. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense considering the myriad of countries that have more than two parties and have democratic features. So this dualist explanation right out of the gate seems somewhat implausible. Another explanation is socialization. If we have done something a certain way for a long period of time, we are unlikely to change it. And that can be said of parties. Since we have had, from the beginning, the setup of the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson fighting against the Federalists, who were more ideological to start with and then more electoral after. We've set it up that way. We're going to continue that way. It's hard to change that. There are also institutional barriers. Things like single-member districts make it hard for minority parties to gain any ground. The Electoral College certainly doesn't favor third or fourth parties at all. All of these systems combined make it really hard for anyone other than the two parties to survive. Our system, in other words, our institutions, are just not set up for multiple parties. And this isn't just electorally, but if you think about Congress and the independents in Congress, usually they pick a party to caucus with. They may be independent, but they lean one way or another. And then there are legal challenges for getting on the ballot in certain states. Getting in a primary may be easy. You may not have a primary. You may have a different system of choosing. But a general election is harder, and so third parties, if they do not meet certain qualifications, have to go out and get more signatures to get on a ballot. There are timelines, and all of that costs money. So there are a multitude of explanations, some of which are easily testable by removing barriers and adding new ones, and some of them are not. But if we look at minority parties or third parties, we can see that not all third parties are created equally. Generally speaking, there are four types of third parties. The ideological parties are made up of people who feel like the two major parties are not adequately dealing with issues on a fundamental level across several issue areas. So usually these are small, but they're longer term. So the Green Party, Libertarian Party, Socialist Party, and there are various socialist parties. These are longer standing groups, and they have various issue stances. They mirror in many ways the major parties, but they are smaller and not as powerful. Then we have single issue parties, who are parties made up of people who feel like the major parties are ignoring a key issue. So they form their own party to advocate for it. And this might, for some people, replace the traditional party breakdown, or it might supplement it. So an example of this was the Free Soil Party, which was a party that sought to abolish slavery in new states. The Prohibition Party, which sought to invoke prohibition in the nation, and currently the U.S. Marijuana Party, which seeks to legalize marijuana across the country. Then we have economic protest parties. These are people who get together and feel that the economic system itself needs reforming, and they feel left out of economic prosperity or opportunity. So usually there's a few issues, but they're all centered around the idea of economic wealth or disparity. And then finally we have splinter parties, which may take on functions of the first three, but these are parties formed within another party or by major players from another party that then separate into their own party. So they're usually only around for a short term, but they may be fairly popular when they exist. So we have Ross Perot in the Reform Party, Teddy Roosevelt in the Bull Moose Party, etc. We can try and talk about current party movements, like the Tea Party, the Occupy movement, and now the Resistors. But none of them have formally spawned off into their own third parties. And the predictive value of some of our past examples is not that high. So sometimes we have to figure out what it is that makes third parties tick and what they actually contribute. So they do contribute quite a bit, despite not winning many elections. They provide or present new ideas or new ways of dealing with old issues, so potential new solutions. They bring sustained attention to important issues that major parties ignore. The Green Party started, for example, because the major parties were ignoring environmental issues. Now, the Green Party has grown significantly since then, but that was their primary impetus. They provide a home to alienated groups of people who are not ideologically similar to the major parties, while keeping them somewhat interested in politics. And they also keep major parties up to date and on their toes. It's unsurprising, in fact, that many of these third parties don't work because they're absorbed back into the major party system when their ideas become popular enough. So, we've talked about some of this, but why don't they rise higher or last longer? It's really difficult to raise money for third party issues and candidates, and getting publicly funded provides limitations as well. It's not easy to be successful in our system for longer periods of time with all the legal barriers about getting on the ballot and getting recognized at debates and in other forums. The media attention is really lagging, and the media doesn't focus on third parties. And then we have structural issues like winner takes all and single member districts in the Electoral College, which discourages third parties from continuing to run cycle after cycle. And some states don't allow third parties on the ballot for general elections unless they collect enough signatures, and that takes time and money that is unlikely to work for every third party. Now, here's some general ideas that we need to focus on. Political parties may exist, but that doesn't mean that they have the same importance over time. In fact, party identification has declined in recent years. This is because parties used to be the main source of information about government and politics and policy, the main source of government jobs, main ways to network for jobs both inside and outside of the government. And these days they have much more competition in all of these categories. So there's a lack of tangible benefits to your membership. And then people psychologically tend to feel that they are independent, even though most of us are not if we take an ideological test. And we try, especially in the US, to reject party labels. Yet at the same time, as party identification has declined, party ideology has solidified. Safe districts produce more ideologically liberal or conservative members of Congress or representatives in state legislatures who do not see the value in collaboration and compromise. New issues have divided the parties greatly over the past few decades, and in fact, the parties themselves have solidified. There's been a sorting within the parties such that if you tend to believe in certain things, you probably have switched parties as a representative. So Joe Lieberman was a good example of this, someone who had switched parties or at least became independent because he felt like the Democratic Party no longer represented him. At the same time, this creates an issue of polarization. We have people who are strongly opposed on a variety of issues and unlikely to come to a middle ground. So our party system has changed, our party identification has changed, and the roles of party in our system have changed. The APSA, the American Political Science Association, in 1950 wrote a report called Toward a More Responsible Two-Party System. And I had you read that here. I also have my American government students read it. It's a really prescient account of what could happen with a stale and unsophisticated two-party system. So the first thing that the APSA does in 1950 is to outline the role of the parties. And they say that the parties refine public attitudes, they advocate for certain policies, and they effectuate the goals of representation. So that's what the parties are there to do. And the two-party system should do two particular things. One is that the parties must be able to introduce policy programs, so think Lyndon Johnson and his Great Society, or FDR and the New Deal. And two, parties must be able to actually effectuate such programs, that it's not enough to introduce them, they have to be able to effectuate them. And the dangers of a stagnant two-party system are really important to understand because we are already in 1950 seeing trends of this, and it may sound more familiar in modern times. So one is that the inadequacy of the two-party system will lead to good programs failing because public support cannot be organized to support them. People are too busy fighting over representation and too busy fighting intra-party over different issues, and so good programs will fail. As that happens, the second thing happens, which is the people shift responsibility from Congress to the president in lieu of strong parties. And this presents constitutional problems where we have a president, or an imperial presidency, as some call it, where the president is doing more than what he, or eventually she, should be doing in that office. 3, the two parties that are left will no longer be respected and will disintegrate under the weight of these problems. And this happens because people look to other sources of power. And finally, the inability of the two parties for consistent action and meaningful programs may allow extremists to take over the political realm and ignore the public good. Because the political parties become too centered on the idea of winning representation and maintaining power, they ignore the perils of extremism within their own parties. So we can see many of these things happening. And the APSA warns that even once it starts to happen, you can move back, but that there can be a two-party system that works. So many people say, well, we need third parties. That's the only way to move forward. The political science literature would tend to disagree on this, that two parties can work. And in fact, in systems where there are multiple parties, sometimes there are two dominant parties for a long period of time. That is not to say that a two-party system can't work, but those two parties have to be cognizant of their role within society and their role within the political system to make it work. Mayhew presents a different set of questions about parties, and this is in the context of divided government. Divided government exists when the parties that control the House, the Senate, and the presidency are not all within the same party. So one of those three, or two of those three, belongs to a different party than the president, let's say. And this was typically thought of to provide bad consequences. And the old questions used to center, Mayhew says, around a lack of policy making, that there was just a lack of policy being created and a lack of oversight on behalf of the government, that only oversight would occur when Congress is controlled by the opposition party of the president, not the same party. And he says that those aren't the fundamental questions we should be asking ourselves, that there are 5 new questions we should look at. And he challenges along the way conventional wisdom in all of this. So first, are the laws passed in divided government worse than those in a unified government? And he says that there is a lack of evidence to answer this question in the affirmative. Second, is there programmatic coherence across statutes passed by Congress in divided government? In other words, is there an ideological program being carried out? And is there budgetary coherence? Are there priorities being set by Congress and the president? And he gives mixed evidence for that. Then he asks, does government administration fail because of a divided government? In other words, if Congress passes a statute, does the president fail to enact it if he doesn't agree? Again, he lays out a case contrary to the conventional wisdom. Does foreign diplomacy fail under divided government? And here you can already sense the theme, but also the idea that foreign diplomacy would fail in a divided government necessitates Congress thinking that it has more of a role in diplomacy than it does. The final question is, are lower-income Americans suffering under divided government? And he points to the fact that we might think of the New Deal or the Great Society as evidence that you need single-party control of all 3 of those entities. But he says that outside of those 2 major programs, there's not evidence to support this claim. So overall, what Mayhew is talking about is that we actually have learned to govern ourselves when we have divided government. So those are 2 of the 3 readings this week. The Wasserman reading takes you down a more technical path in terms of what parties do to win. And I think that that's a key observation that needs to be read thoroughly to understand what technology is involved and what the parties do during their quote-unquote downtime to build up around election time. So I will leave you there this week to read through that, and we will talk about it both in the reading quiz and in the blog.